Hey, welcome to Lab 20, question 1. A fall in the price of oil is a real shock. A rise in consumer optimism is aggregate demand shock. A hurricane that destroys factories in Florida is a real shock. Good weather that creates a bumper crop of California oranges is real shock. A rise in sales tax is aggregate demand shock. Foreigners watch fewer US-made movies is aggregate demand shock. Fear is aggregate demand shock. New inventions occur at a faster pace than usual is real shock. A faster money growth rate is aggregate demand shock. Question 2. There has been 11 recessions since World War II. B. Since World War II, there's been one recession that had an unemployment rate over 10%. And then C. Approximately 7 times the unemployment rate peaked after the recession ended. Question 3. When inflation rises, the solo growth rate remains unchanged.
For question 4, real shocks can either be negative or positive. They are not exclusively negative by definition. For question 5, when a negative real shock hits, the long-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. For question 6, when a negative real shock hits, the aggregate demand curve stays in the same place, but the point on the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left, which means that the inflation rate will go up and the growth rate will go down.
For question 7, it asked if a negative real shock hits, shifting the percentage of real growth per year, what would happen? It would still be positive because if the on average real growth was 3.2, so it would shift it down to 1.2% real growth. And I would not call this a recession because the economy is still growing. It's just not as fast as it normally would. For question 8, a negative real shock would rise inflation. A negative real shock would decrease spending growth, and then a fall in spending growth would decrease real growth. For question 9, if expected inflation is 5% and actual is 7%, this would cause real growth to fall. If expected is 3% and actual is 1%, it would cause it to rise. If expected is the same as actual, it'll cause it to remain unchanged. If expected is 7% and actual is negative 10%, it'll cause it to rise. And then if expected is negative 1% and actual is 0%, it'll cause it to fall. For question 10, it has to calculate the inflation rate in this economy. So according to the quantity theory, if the growth rate is 1% and the aggregate demand is equal to 7%, then the aggregate demand equals the growth rate plus inflation. So inflation must be 6%. And then for part B, same sort of thing. If spending growth was 15%, then the inflation rate would be 14% since the growth rate is 1%.
For question 11 on part A, when the inflation rate is greater than people expect, the short-run aggregate supply eventually shifts up. But when the inflation rate is less than people expect, the short-run aggregate supply eventually shifts down. For part B, when the real GDP growth is above the solo growth rate, short-run aggregate supply eventually shifts to the left over time. But when it is below the solo growth rate, the short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right. And so the reason why these two are equivalent is because, firstly, given the shape of the short-run aggregate supply curve, moving it to the left is equivalent to moving it up, while moving it to the right is equivalent to moving it down. And also, if the inflation is greater than expected, the growth rate will be higher or greater than the solo growth rate, and vice versa in the opposite direction. For question 12, with a real shock, when the real growth rate is worse than usual, the inflation must be higher than usual. With an aggregate demand shock, when the real growth rate is worse than usual, the inflation must also be higher than usual. And then for question 14, we're asked to draw a graph showing the short-run labor supply curve if the workers are unwilling to work at a price other than what was agreed upon. That is what is shown in the graph in the slide. And then for part B, the fall in the labor demand will cause a surplus if this is in the long run, but it will cause a shortage in the short run. And then for part C, the fall in labor demand will cause the price of labor to fall over time. So this has been our lab. Thank you. We appreciate you for listening.